Hello, Timothy. Welcome back to my abode.
I know. I've got the good view. Actually, you have a really good view because people can't see what you see from your desk. So you have a good view too.
That's right,
But
it's
yes.
mine. All mine.
Oh my gosh. And you know what? Every time he's like, "Are you talking to me? To
I
me?"
am really interested and excited to speak with our guest today. We're going to talk all things dementia, which is, you know,
Right
my
up your alley.
my pot of people.
Yeah.
Uh, and interestingly enough, in the last couple of years past when COVID was finished, we're not, I don't know where that line is, but we've had coming into my company looking for retirement, long-term care, we have had a spike of cognitive issues coming through our company because a lot of people went through COVID and didn't make a move when they should have, and they were extra isolated, as you remember.
Right.
In COVID. And so all of that plays a part. And so a lot of the people that we help right now in these days have some form of cognition issue. And we're always planning for multiple things with them. And so I'm really interested in today's guest for sure.
The uh the other thing too is you know this, but my dad was misdiagnosed
Hmm.
as having dementia. And to this day, I firmly believe that it was a bit of ageism going on. And in fact, he had cancer. And so by the time we found out that the cancer had spread to his brain, um, he went from being diagnosed to dying in 7 weeks. So, I'm excited for this conversation too, because in some cases, and certainly in my own very painful history, early diagnosis is important because sometimes it might not be what you think it is, and like, oh, it's just you're aging, right?
Yes.
So, yeah, and welcome back from your vacation.
Thank you. I'm not tan because I slather on the sunscreen because I'm so fair that I just come back like a lobster if I didn't. So,
And it was hot
yeah,
where you were.
in the
Very, very
40s,
hot.
in the 40s. And I brought it home apparently. And so, sorry, everybody.
So yeah, this is gonna be a great conversation, and welcome home, and thank you for having me in your home during this heat wave because it certainly beats being at a campsite.
Well, thank you for taking care of the fuzzy ones as well. They've enjoyed their time.
I had 5 and 3 slept in the bed with me.
As they do, as they do.
As they do, yeah.
All right, well, let's bring our guest in.
Okay, terrific.
Coming in hot.
Well, this is going to be a great conversation. And in the run up, Amy and I were talking about our own experiences, both professionally and personally, with this incredibly important topic. So we have an expert with us today, Dr. Saskia Sivananthan. And we are delighted to welcome you because this is a show about women's mental health, and certainly this is a very important topic, both physically and emotionally, for a lot of people. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Can you just give us sort of the Coles notes on you and your expertise? Because we certainly have done a lot of research on you, but a lot of our viewers and listeners on radio would want to know how you came into this area of expertise.
Sure. Well, I think I was always fascinated by the brain just generally as like one of these organs that we didn't know very much about. And here it was, it's crucial to everything, right? From our physical well-being to mental, emotional, how we interact with the world. So I really just wanted to understand that more. So I came from it from a very sort of neuroscience background. Um, but actually, I was living in Montreal as a grad student, and my neighbor had mild cognitive impairment that later became dementia. And he lived alone, he had no family. And we became friends. And I, in essence, became his proxy caregiver, kind of just fell into it. and started picking up his medication, groceries, visiting when he's all of the things that caregiving we don't talk about, but that is this additional thing that we carry with us. And he ultimately passed away alone, actually, in an ER room while I was visiting family in Vancouver, and no one called me because I'm not family and I was not, power of attorney or anything like that. And I think that was really the click point for me. If that was my experience as a young grad student, I couldn't even imagine what families would be going through. And I knew nothing about supports at all, and I never did find out about it at that time with him. So I went back to grad school again. This time, got a PhD in health policy and systems research because I really wanted us to focus on getting better coordinated care in dementia. And so that became my focus. I worked in health systems across Canada, was recruited to the WHO, and we launched the Global Dementia Action Plan there. So worked at the global level, working with different countries who are tackling the same problem, but have different capacities and needs. Before I came back to Canada, I worked at the Alzheimer's Society of Canada. I was chief of research there. And now we founded our own think tank called the Brainwell Institute, which is focused on really moving evidence into policy and action, and really in this coordinated effort.
Sorry, I'm trying to think of the right way to ask this, because I had just in the opening that Amy and I recorded talked about the fact that my father was misdiagnosed, and they just sort of assumed that he was having cognitive issues because he was 75, and in fact he had fully metastatic cancer. So your work in terms of educating, I think, is exceptionally important, because I think that we just sort of assume if you get old, you start, losing your marbles, and that's not always the case.
Absolutely. And first, I'm sorry to hear about that experience that you had with your dad, but
Yeah.
also to say that unfortunately, it's not the first time I've heard it. And I think it comes back again to this stigma that we have around the disease itself, right? Like dementia is a condition actually, because it's over 100 different types of diseases. And we don't even realize that or talk about it that way. So Alzheimer's disease, it's the most common, but there are many, many other forms of diseases that can cause those symptoms, including overlap with other diseases like cancer, as you just mentioned. And I think we tend to dismiss older adults generally because we A, think of this as, well, you're getting older, you're going to get this disease, and B, we can't do anything about it. Because that's another misconception around this disease, that there's really not much that can be done around this condition. So why bother investigating it or doing too much more around it? But then, to the other point you made about the podcast itself, it is women who are primarily impacted by dementia, both living with it or caring for it. There's this interesting statistic. It's interesting because it also makes me very sad. 1 in 3 Canadians know someone who's living with dementia, but only 1 in 5 think that dementia care is actually improved or has improved over the last 5 years to actually support people. And when you consider that we've invested, 81 million in a national dementia strategy, but if it's not impacting the day-to-day care of people and how they're experiencing it, then it should give us pause.
Absolutely. I think your work is so important. And to Timothy's point earlier, this is like my everyday, right? I work exclusively with families and the senior population. And I wrote about it in my book, Breadcrumbs. So one of the questions that I was really interested in is the coordination of care for dementia, because honestly, it's a little terrifying. I mean, that's my main job, is coordinating housing and care. And if we're having trouble as a knowledge base of professionals, families are super struggling. The dementia strategy has major challenges and it's not really faring well, I don't think, compared to other countries. Can you expand on it a little bit for us?
Yeah, I mean, and you've raised a good point, right? It's the care navigation, because there's no way to navigate, there's no pathway. So, even if you can get the diagnosis, which itself is fraught because it takes, what, on average 2 years to get a diagnosis of dementia. And for people who might have young onset dementia, it can be up to 5 years living with all these symptoms and not knowing what you're dealing with it, seeing that it's progressing and really not getting kind of the supports around it. But then once you get that diagnosis, knowing what to do next and where to go is a huge issue in our current system because we don't think about dementia that way and we don't provide care that way, which was the whole point of the report that we published just last week, actually. It's called Mind the Gap. And what we did was we took a look at internationally, what have other countries done when they have a national dementia strategy? What did they do to implement it so that it really supported better coordination of care, so that people knew where to go next, how to access things, and got really good post-diagnostic supports? And what we found was we compared ourselves to peer countries that are similar in terms of, income level, that it's a federated system, right? We have the provincial federal kind of relationship around how care gets implemented. And what we found is Canada's kind of 7 out of 12 right now. We're kind of middle to end of the pack. And that's when we had a national dementia strategy with funding, which expired last year. But the countries that have really moved forward are countries like Austria, Germany, Australia, Scotland, and Denmark. And what they do is they've really convened both their equivalent of provinces and territories with the federal government, their equivalent federal government, to create this coordinating system. So then we went and we said, well, but this is not new news, right? Like we know that we can do this better. What have we done here in our country that has worked well? And that's where we looked at cancer and stroke. And we looked at the strategies and how care was coordinated in both of those fields. And look, my disclaimer at the beginning of all of this is neither cancer nor stroke are perfect by any means with, what it could be. But if you compared it to 10 years or 20 years ago, there's a huge shift in the type of care that you get if you first to get a diagnosis of cancer or stroke, and then the kinds of outcomes. And that's because what we've done well is within each of our provinces, we have an agency or a network that's responsible for coordinating care. We have data where we understand both the person, the patient who's diagnosed with that disease, but also their families and their caregivers and what it means to be supporting that person and what kind of supports they need to do that. And then there's a very clear kind of path, multiple pathways where you know where to go next. If you're diagnosed, you have your appointments lined up, you know what therapies are available. They already start talking to you about palliative care, rehabilitative care, and we don't do any of that for dementia. We kind of just leave people to figure it out on their own. And I'll give you this example because I spoke to this gentleman just like 2 days ago, and he's 82, was just diagnosed with, early stage dementia by his family doctor. And his family doc said, okay, yeah, it kind of looks like you're not doing too great. We'll refer you to a neurologist. You'll speak to them in a year. And that was it. And he was just told to go home. And he said, how is this how we're caring for dementia? We need to be much more proactive. And so he's taking it on himself to be proactive. But that's not really how a system should work. It shouldn't be up to the individual to have to go source all of that information out, right? And so, as you know, Amy, with having to help people navigate, that's the whole point.
Well, when you said we're a middle of the pack, I could feel that. Like I can feel that with my clients, my families. And, we have lots of people that come to us undiagnosed and diagnosed, like professionally. And more often than not, they're not even given, like in Ottawa, we have the Dementia Society, which is similar to the Alzheimer Society. They're not even given a contact for the Dementia Society, which is like the main thing. Like just give them something. And I would say that it also is in the aspect of like caring for seniors in general in our healthcare. It is very reactive, not proactive, and what I've seen, like working with many families over the last 20 years, is that it just really, I don't know that the government is really taking an interest. And now the pressure builds every year, especially with housing and care and all this stuff. Pressure builds. And I'm looking at the government systems thinking, anytime now, like do something anytime now. And I'm wondering if the cancer and stroke situation is in a better position because it's fueled by younger people. Generally, it's fueled by everybody, but there's younger people that have to deal with it as well. It's not a lot of, we get early onset dementia and things like that, but a lot of the people that have dementia are seniors, late stage or later stages. And I wonder if that's why more money, research, and attention has been paid to things like cancer and stroke, because it's kind of across the board of ages, which is kind of infuriating to me, to be honest.
Yep.
I agree. I mean, I think there's definitely some of that driving it, that because it's older adults who are mainly dealing with this disease, and also though, because the kind of care that dementia requires is not driven entirely medically, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
much of dementia care is the day-to-day things, right? It's the food, it's getting dressed, it's the finances, it's your housing, and those are harder. They're not as tangibly health specific, to kind of be able to focus it that way. But yeah, a
Mhm.
lot of it I think is driven just with the way we think about older adults, right? That they're at that end stage, and so we think that there's no real need to do much or support them as well. But I wanted to come back to your point about how Canada's been doing, in that the National Dementia Strategy itself is a really great document. Like, it hits all the key things around: we need to raise more awareness, we need better coordination of care, we need more investment in research. But the two areas that the government primarily moved forward was around research and awareness. And the care piece is the piece that suffered, but really is the one that probably needed the most attention. But it's trickier and harder because care is delivered at the provincial level, not at the federal level. And so you need to have a strong advocacy and coordination that links those two and ensures that the implementation of dementia is happening in that cohesive way at the provincial level. And so that's what we've started doing at Brainwell.
I think it also is the fact that it goes along the same lines as family caregiving. It's like the invisible workforce, and we're 25% now, soon to be 50% in family caregivers. And it's this invisible workforce that's worth billions and billions of dollars if we had to pay for it to be. And that's like, that's one of the things. It's like I understand what you're saying. It's like it's not medically tangible, you can't hold it, but I think it's naive of people to think that all these family caregivers, we have all of your reports, other people's reports, Stats Canada, all the stuff that says it's happening, and yet people are just like, nope, it's not happening still, and we just keep getting deeper and deeper and deeper into it. And on our end, by the time people get to us, those family members are completely burnt out. They don't know what to do. We always have, bureaucracy between public and private systems, where I'm a private company, for instance, just using my company, and trying to get the public system, like hospitals and whatnot, to give out private company information, even if they can't do anything in the public system, is almost non-existent. It's so much red tape and for nothing, really. I can see it from a different angle, I guess, but like it just, you're not helping anybody by just blocking their resources and not even giving the Dementia Society as like a very obvious solution, not a solution, but an obvious step for assistance.
Yeah, like a connection or a support point, right?
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, like coming back to that original point about what dementia is on that day-to-day basis, just because it's not medical or clinical doesn't mean it's not essential. It's essential backbone care. And in the report, we reference this. If you were actually to consider how much it costs to have, and primarily women, step away from the workforce, right? Because How do you provide almost 40 hours of care? As dementia progresses, that's where it gets to 40 hours per week of care and work full time. And if you're a sandwich generation, you're probably caring for your own kids and, your family, and then trying to care for older adults. Like, it's impossible. So they would need to step away, which means lost productivity of 25 billion a year. But we've not stopped to think about what that's going to mean for us in the long run, of having so much of the workforce step away from what would be considered economic productivity, in order to provide this unpaid caregiving.
And, Amy talks to me all the time about the sandwich generation, and I was that both of my parents were sick within a 12-month period, like life-threatening kind of stuff. And I also had a daughter who was leaving for university at the same time that this was sort of all going on. And at that time, I owned my own company. And I wish I had met you way back then, because, and my parents lived in they lived in Kingston, Ontario. So, a 2-hour drive back and forth. And finally, I just moved to Kingston until my dad died. Other than maybe having gone to the Dementia Society, because again, it was a family doctor who told us that my dad failed a MOCA test, but there was no sort of physical exam until he started to really lose weight rapidly. What tools would you give to sandwiched people who are in this kind of thing? Because it seems to require a lot of advocacy, but I didn't know, honestly, that renal cancer can cause those kind of symptoms. I literally believed that my dad had dementia. Until he physically started to change rapidly. And then it was too late, obviously. So what would you say to, I'm now 57, but what would you have said to 52-year-old me?
Yeah, we do get this question a lot, actually, and so much so that we actually put together, like, what are the top 10 things you need to do as soon as you've gotten a diagnosis or you're concerned or worried about potentially dementia? And I would say, yes, absolutely, connecting to the Dementia Society, the Alzheimer's Society, Parkinson's Society, Down Syndrome Society, because what a lot of people don't also realize is that for the Down syndrome community, they're at much, much higher risk of developing dementia very early, like in their 50s. Up to 50% can develop Alzheimer's,
Oh,
because
wow.
of the genetic component related to, yeah. And so really connecting early, and all of those societies, they're all nonprofit charities. Even if you don't have a diagnosis, they can still help you with education material, figuring out how to navigate the system. But the second I'd say is that access rehabilitative care. We don't think about rehabilitation when it comes to dementia, but there's a lot of evidence to show that early physical therapy, OT, speech therapy can really help maintain your abilities if you're living with dementia for as long as possible, because a lot of the caregiving burden comes when the person's starting to lose those abilities, right? Higher risk of falls and mood swings, not eating as well, like they start losing weight, all of those things. And so the earlier you can start putting those networks of supports in place, the better. We also say, really thinking about power of attorney, financial and health as soon as possible. In fact, I started having those conversations already with my loved ones, even though no one has any of those signs or symptoms, because I'm like, we don't want to be making these decisions in crisis. In crisis, when you're burnt out and you've hit a wall, you're unable to make really good decisions because your choices are so limited at that point. And so really trying to put those networks in place early. And then what we've also said is really trusting the people around you and telling them and asking for their support. A lot of the time with dementia, it's very stigmatized. It's seen as a mental health condition. And so people are not wanting to talk about it. They don't want to acknowledge it. Sometimes the person and, their partner or their caregiver, they don't go out anymore because they're trying to kind of hide that. But the social engagement is actually really important and helpful, because you're raising awareness and people seeing you and recognizing that just because you have dementia doesn't mean that you can't participate in your life and your community. But also it means that you're getting some of the benefit of that social engagement. You're not alone in doing all of these pieces. But unfortunately, so much of what needs to be done for dementia is the person having to go out and find all of this information and get connected. I'd also say immediately get onto and access home and community care, get onto the wait list, get the assessments done as soon as possible, because those take time, and B, you don't want to wait until you get to the point again that it's a crisis, because then you're going to end up either in acute care and waiting to be placed in long-term care, or moving to long-term care when you're not ready. And none of those are options that anyone really wants.
I have a pickle here.
Go for it.
Speaking of long-term care, right? Our system is broken, and it's hard because those folks with earlier dementia may not even qualify for long-term care. And so I am with you. We plan, then we plan again, and then we go back and we reevaluate and we plan again. And so I'm just like annoyed with our healthcare system for all of the families that we work with, because there's people out there that want to be proactive and they want to get on the list and they want to do that. In our area, the list can be 6 years long to get into long-term care. And then they need to make a plan in between and all of this. And it's so difficult for families and so challenging. And a lot of our families, to your point, won't even discuss it because there's such a stigma around dementia. And they're also, some of them are even dealing with like the seniors specifically that have just gone way too far into the diagnosis. So to your point about POAs and things like that, like always have them done early. I've got mine. People thought I was nuts when I did mine in my 20s because I've been in this industry for so long. And I was like, no, like I can always reevaluate, but at least I have something, because who knows? But there's so many people that don't have any power of attorney or wills. And we went through this with my grandma, where she was actually coerced, I don't know, by my uncle to change her wills and POAs gradually as her memory got worse and what the family was blocked out. And it's just like this whole challenge. And a lot of people get to a point where they're being deemed incompetent to make decisions, and then that's it. That's the POA, that's the will, that's it. And so if it's not done, you're up the creek. If it's done and it's not right, you're up the creek. And I just like, there's so many things that are lost to caregivers and families once things progress so much, because going back to the fact that there's such a stigma around cognitive impairment that no one wants to talk about it. And I mean, half of my career is telling people to talk about it. Here's how you do it. Here's something to say. Here's how you start the conversation. And it's, folks like all of us that are out there being like, okay, let's do this. But unfortunately, we're outnumbered.
Yeah.
And why the stigma? I mean, I don't know, except, obviously Amy and I are also besties, and she knows I had a head-on collision, and my memory is not what it used to be. And I had to get really brave and tell some people that I don't remember stuff, like, and the shame is like, I was hit. I was the one that was hit. and but I mean, the question, I guess, for either one of you, but why are we so ashamed?
Yeah, we are. We're ashamed when it comes to mental health generally, I think, but especially with dementia. A lot, I think, has to do with, we see our memories as foundational to who we are as people. And so I think we worry that if we cannot recall things the same way, does that mean we are no longer valuable as a person? It's that personhood that has shifted, right? Um, and And yet there's so many times that, and so much evidence that show that people, even at the very end stages of dementia, where they might not be able to verbally communicate anymore, are still very present and can be very engaged. The communication and a relationship is always possible. It often requires the person who's the caregiver or the family to understand and meet the person living with dementia where they are. But I think because we see it as that, oh, this person's gone, they're just not who they are anymore, and therefore you kind of like almost isolate them. I think that's a lot of the stigma. And then the other part of the stigma is that, again, we don't have any good therapies yet, right? We don't really have any good drugs around dementia or just general therapies that are being prescribed and accessible. And so then again, people kind of see it as, well, why should I get diagnosed? Because if I do, there's nothing that anyone can do about it. And that goes back to the point in the report that we were making, which is that if you don't have a system where people are being diagnosed and have a pathway through, when any drugs or therapies come to the market, like we know there's a new class of drugs specifically for Alzheimer's disease that are slowly making their way through. And it's the first of its kind that's trying to get at the underlying cause of Alzheimer's specifically. Now, it's a first class, which means that it's not going to be as effective. I think only impacts, slows cognition by about 6 to 8 months. But still, even to access that in our health system, you can't. First, you can't access it here because it's not been approved. But even if you were to try to access it elsewhere, you're paying out of pocket, and there's no way to scale that through the system. And with cancer and with stroke, they were like that too. Like 20 years ago, we didn't have the cocktail of therapies and options that we had for cancer and stroke. It was the C word. There was a whole series about it, right? Where you didn't want to talk about it or tell people because you didn't want the pity, you didn't want the stigma, and it was seen as something that you can do anything about. And that has really shifted. People really start seeing now that there's survivorhood, right? It's not a death sentence. And that's, I think, where we still are with dementia. We still kind of see it as this death sentence. And we don't want to do anything about it. And especially, I think, to Amy's point, because it's older adults, that's that other layer of, well, now they're like right at the end stages, so why bother? And it's such a horrific way to look at it, because we are all going to age. It's a definitive thing. Is that how we want to all live?
I am all riled up. Kim's laughing. I know she knows I'm all riled up because it's true, and it's really sad. I mean, on the mental health note, what do we do for families? There's a lot of families coming through the system that are in super denial. I mean, if they can find me or my team, we have to drag the information out, and half the time there's not fibbing, but not telling the whole truth. There's super denial. Is your mom a wanderess? No, she's fine. She goes for a walk. She got lost once. It's all right. It's like, that's not all right. Like, it's going to escalate. And I've seen people in their homes where it's just like, your mom really needs to do something at the moment. No, she's okay for a while more. And it's like they just are taking on this huge burden. They're taking on this huge mental health issue because it's kind of like a duel, because they're trying to care for their loved one, and they know that they have a mental health condition, and so they're trying to do that, but they're also trying not to tell people about it because they don't want their mom or dad seen in a different way. Yet they're also burning out and they don't want to be seen by this, and it's just like, how do we help them?
I think you articulated it perfectly. This is exactly it, right? And I think the sooner we come to terms with dementia as a condition that needs this level of support in our system, we've done it for this is impacting 750,000 Canadians. And for every person who's living with that disease, there is at least one, if not more, people, families providing support. So we're talking well over 1.5 to 2 million Canadians impacted. And And the scale of this disease means that we need to coordinate care. We need to set very clear benchmarks and outcomes. We did that for stroke and cancer. We said we want the mortality rates to be X, and then we worked towards that. We want patient-driven outcomes and quality of care where patients report how they feel and whether they got the supports they needed. We don't do any of that. We don't even know how many caregivers really for dementia because we don't collect that kind of information. Um, and really, it is a lot of the nonprofits and the charities that are providing the gap support. So, support counseling, one-on-one counseling, getting private supports like yours, accessing, family therapies and support groups through these societies is really one of the only ways. A lot of folks have even told me that they go online and like just having online communities or Reddit threads where you can really acknowledge what this, what you're dealing with, what this disease is, and getting very practical supports has been where people have gone for that. I mean, the other side to this as well is that when you think about paid care, we're talking, personal support workers, PSWs, who are also often women, often from, racialized, diverse communities, not well trained or supported, and not well paid for the kind of care that they're providing. So is it a surprise that it's A, hard to get that kind of support, and B, to retain that workforce? Because the turnover and the burnout rate in that workforce is intense. But if we were able to stabilize that better, then you would have a workforce you could lean on, instead of only the families trying to manage all of this by themselves, right?
And I feel like I'm going to be this like huge Debbie Downer, because when you guys are talking about the system is broken, it's actually, I think, breaking more as this aging population moves through the system. So governments are going to be prioritizing spending, and now is probably not going to be a great time to tell them that we want more money spent on dementia. So it's like, it would appear to me, and you two are experts, I'm not, but it would appear to me that this is going to be a really hard time to get more spending because the system is broken. And I mean, I'm certainly inside the system right now with, 28 injuries from a car accident. And some of the stuff that I have seen is really scary in terms of, just look at, I think I spent 18 hours in an emergency room. So what can we do? I mean, I don't know what the answer is.
I mean, here's my opinion. I'm an optimist. I think that is the reason why I started Brain Well. It was because the way I see it is that we have a public payer system, which is already a strength because a lot of countries don't. If you look at the kind of two-tiered systems that other countries have, it makes it even harder. And this is actually one of the places where I'd say it's more of a strength in Canada versus the US, whereas we almost always look to the US as being further ahead than we are. But I do think that when you look at the data around dementia, so to your point about wait times in the ER and bed times, right? Over 50% of what are called ALC beds, alternate levels of care hospital beds, are occupied by people living with a form of cognitive impairment or dementia. And they're occupied because they have nowhere else to go and they're waiting to be placed in long-term care, which then has this downstream effect on access for others for hospitalizations and for urgent care use. Now, just shifting them over somewhere else is not going to result in the outcomes that you want for anyone. And so the case that we've been making in the report is that you do not need to spend a massive amount of money. You can be efficient with how you spend your money and still integrate it into existing infrastructure. And I think that's the key to the case to be made around dementia, is that this is impacting economics. It's impacting productivity. No matter how you cut it, it's going to impact your workforce, a younger workforce who's going to be having to deal with dementia, your healthcare system, and then these older adults are still voters. These older adults are very active consumers, and we underestimate that how much of that is also contributing to the economy. And so the sooner we shift to a focus on being less reactive and being more proactive, I think Amy's point. I agree. A lot of the lifestyle interventions are very clearly showing that putting those in place early, and by early I mean, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, even into your 70s, making these changes can reduce the overall risk of dementia. But then putting the kind of coordination and pathways in place doesn't require a huge expenditure. What it requires is a prioritization and coordination. And that's the case for how you then are better able to support. Because as AI and technology comes into play, blood-based biomarkers is another big area that has really been shifting. So, you talked about how your dad failed the MOCA, and it's hard because the MOCA is a paper-based test. It really measures cognitive and not necessarily functional decline. So sometimes you don't catch how far along the person might be in dementia functionally, because they still might be passing their MOCA tests, but gets farther along where financially they've been making these kinds of decisions that have huge impact on the family. But blood-based biomarkers and other types of diagnostics allow you to better figure this out earlier. So you have an earlier window to be able to make these changes and to then have the networks and supports over a longer period. So that's the way I really look at that. And again, we've done it for other diseases: renal, cancer, palliative, stroke. This is no different in the scale and scope of what needs to be done.
And maybe just a little bit of levity before, because I know that Amy is going to have other questions, but maybe a moment of levity is my father was a PhD psychologist and a professor at Queen's University. And he didn't want to admit to anyone that he was starting to have changes. So I always thought that that was really the greatest irony of this whole situation was he taught soldiers, and then he tried to hide it from everybody. So yeah.
I love the movement around dementia-friendly communities and age-friendly communities for exactly that reason, right? Because it means that when we make our communities safer and accessible for anyone who's older, anyone who might have cognitive impairment or dementia or a disability, we're making it better for everybody else, right? And if we can do that as a community, it also means that then the pressure is off on you as a caregiver to have to then manage everything all the time. Like, could you imagine if you're grocery shopping and you're in the line and it's taking longer for the person to like pull out their list or pay, and then everyone behind you is pissed off because they're waiting. Whereas if the clerk had training and if everyone else knew and was also supportive, it would ease the pressure hugely.
I think that's an environment. I'm just saying, there's a lot of jerks out there, I'm telling you. I mean, I think you're right, like all of it. And I think that back to the point we made at the first, advocating is going to be, a major influencer for caregivers. Unfortunately, advocating is very difficult and strenuous and time consuming. But for instance, we had a black mold issue in my house, and we put the pieces together as it went through and we started figuring it out. And I just dove into the internet because in Canada, we don't handle mold very easily. And so I was getting answers from Europe, right? And I was getting tests from Europe to get all it done because I wanted the answers. And so I think that this is not exactly the same, but a similar situation where we're not as advanced as others, and Europe specifically, right? And a lot of the stuff that we deal with and with dementia. And I think that I want the caregivers to know, like, there's information out there. It's out there. You just have to dig on the internet, figure it out. You have to advocate. I know it's exhausting, but once you can start piecing the puzzle together, then you'll have a much clearer way through or next steps. And I feel like, I feel like that's one of the strongest tools at this time as the medical research and all the medical spot is trying to catch up. I feel like, as someone who's been in this industry for a long time, I feel like we're not going to be there for a minute, which is a little bit humdrum for me to say, but I feel like we're working towards it, like people like you, and we're working towards it. But at this point in time, advocating is one of our family caregivers' best friends, I think.
100%. Advocating on multiple fronts, advocating as a family caregiver for the person. And so that means advocating through the health system and not just always accepting what is provided. If you can and need to push, you're going to need to do that. And information is your best friend, as you've just said, educating yourself, but then educating others around you to support you, because you cannot do it alone. You just can't. Um, then I would also say advocating publicly, which is very hard, but is absolutely how other disease states shifted. I mean, I don't, like, there are huge cancer runs where people are describing what they went through in the system, and what it meant to survive, what it meant to not. HIV, AIDS, same thing, hugely stigmatized disease. And it took public advocacy, it took people telling their stories, talking about the suffering, the impact, how it felt to lose loved ones. That was what really started getting the shift and the move. And ultimately, we are all voters and constituents in someone's constituency, which means they are there to work for you and support you. And if they don't ever hear from you and they never know that this is a problem, then, it'll just continue to chug along the way it is. And we cannot continue to do it that way.
And so tell us about your organization that you started.
Sure. So Brainwell is a think tank. We don't provide programs or services, but what we do is we connect people to them if they have questions, if they ask. We work a lot with communities, especially communities like Amy mentioned, who don't want to talk about it, but know that they probably need to. We can be the third party who can come in and provide some of that information, get people engaged. And we found with a lot of diverse communities as well that really, when you start approaching it and you start talking about brain health and really start acknowledging what you're dealing with, the stories come pouring in and the support becomes more accessible then as well, because you're never alone. But what Brainwell does really primarily is we are focused, and we have a 5-year goal, which is to get coordinated care into our health systems in all of our provinces with federal and provincial and territorial engagement. We need pathways through the health system for dementia. And I would love that in 5 years, if someone is able to get diagnosed more easily, but B, that once they get their diagnosis, they're not left for a year to 2 years to figure out what to do, that within a month, they should know what their follow-up appointments are. They should know where they can access and what they can access in the health system. That is the whole point of what we're working on.
This has been such a great conversation. Thank you so much for coming on. We
I
really
was going to say,
appreciate
I wish I had met you a long time ago, and thank you for being that voice for Canadians.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on here and giving me the platform to be able to share this, because I think you're so right. Your listeners and your viewers are the voices that make this difference.
So if you're listening to us today, get out there, advocate, speak up. We're all out here to help. There's professionals, there's people ready to help. Unfortunately, at this moment, you have to do a little bit of digging, but I promise you that you are not alone, and we're all here to help. So until the next time, we'll see you on the inner shift.